I invite you now to pause before the message and pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and salvation. Amen. Let me begin this morning by asking a question. Have you ever been on vacation or visiting some relative somewhere and attended a church other than your own? And you go in and you find a place that seems comfortable to you and you sit down, and after a few minutes someone else comes in behind you and they walk up to where you are and they stand and kind of give you that look until you're so uncomfortable you say, well, can I help you? And they look at you and respond, yes, you can. You're in my seat. Now, I've never had that happen to me personally. You know, ministers get their reserved seats every week, but I've had parishioners tell me that. What I have experienced and witnessed is at meetings or gatherings of organizations, including the church, a relatively newer member of the organization will stand up and offer an opinion or a thought or a suggestion, and someone who's belonged longer stands up and kind of tries to put them in their place. They look at them and say, you know, you've only been a part of this group for 10 years, and my family has been in this community and belonged to this church since the time Moses brought the 10 Commandments down from Sinai. It happens. And unfortunately, it happens too many times in different places. Which leads me to wonder, why are people so possessive, so territorial? Why is it we have within us, I don't know where it comes from, why do we covet certain things and kind of grab and latch on to specific spaces? You know, I have a chair at home that I frequent to watch television or to read or whatever, and I remember an evening when we had company and somebody walked in and flopped down on that chair, and I have to tell you, and it's embarrassing to say, there was a part of me that became uncomfortable. That's my chair, really? You just kind of plop down in it? But it really isn't. And yet I felt that way. And if you look at history and you study history, this theme plays all the way through, where people in power or people who possess, they kind of guard it. We put up stockade fences to mark where our property lines begin. But, it wasn't always that way. Before villages and towns were formed and people lived in a nomadic fashion, following herds to find food and provide sustenance, they just kind of moved around. The Native Americans on the plains did that, following the buffalo, following the herds, and they could not understand when that area was settled why the white man had to say it was his and mark out what that meant. So it's been a part of humanity. And again, if we look as when kingdoms were formed and eventually evolved into nations, replacing tribalism, then people got even more defensive. Still, they had to say, what is mine, not yours, and who am I compared to you, and then make judgment based upon that. They turned to ethnicity. It was no longer where you lived or who your king was or your lifestyle or your property, but it was your ethnic group. I was reading recently a history of a pseudoscientific program in the United States that illustrates this. It's called Eugenics. And eugenics came about in this country between 1890 and after, playing a very, very strong role in our government and in our legal system through the 1920s to 1930s, but it lingers beyond. You see, people looked at one another, and it wasn't a matter of, well, you live on that side and I live on this side. All of a sudden it shifted and it became, you look like that and I look like this, and that's really what matters. That's what separates us, and that what gives me the right to claim what I claim. They looked for a biological explanation, but they did not have the tools or the ability necessary to pursue it. They just thought that, some people were wiser, smarter, more civilized, and successful. So they resorted to things like facial features, people's reading ability, and so forth. Nothing that was rational or scientific, but it led them, in some cases, to define people and place people into 42 different categories. And these categories came to be what we refer to as races. And what's interesting is no matter who did the study or how many people did the study, it always seemed that Northern European or people of Northern European ancestry always made it to the top. They always made it to the top. And the greatest concern of leaders, especially in the 20s, was that the immigrants coming to this country might intermarry with people already here and lower the gene pool. Lower the gene pool. It's frightening to know that this thinking eventually evolved in Hitler's Germany, resulting in the final solution as he tried to create a master race. Now, you may think that, who would buy into this kind of nonsense? Who would? Well, nobody really famous except Teddy Roosevelt, Helen Keller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Alexander Graham Bell, President Wilson, President Harding, and many more. And because these people held positions of prominence, this thinking subtly, if not overtly, became mainstream in our culture, in our legal system, and our government. I mean, it's clearly evident if you go back and you look at laws surrounding immigration, especially voting. At one time you couldn't vote if you couldn't read, and you couldn't vote if you didn't own property. They always had something so that they could protect themselves from the other. I'd like to think, and most of us would like to think, that we've moved beyond this, but it still exists today. As a kid, I remember an adult telling me, and it really becomes an excuse for someone being better than you want to allow them to become. He told me that the reason African American athletes can jump higher and run faster than their white counterparts is because they had a ligament that white folks didn't. I believe that as a child because it made me feel better about my inadequacies. It helped me to not take responsibility or accept ownership of who I am. It's important to believe, and people say this, it's kind of a way of mellowing it out or kind of diluting it. People say these days, all lives matter. But what they forget when they say that, or it seems to me they overlook, is that when you say all lives matter, you are including Black lives, Asian lives, Middle Eastern, Baltic lives, LGBTQ lives. They too matter because they too have played a role in making our nation what it is. And it's time that we move beyond just kind of a bland expectation or explanation to naming and admitting that all of these people contributed. All of them made a difference, and our history books and our stories raise up one sector and forget another, and yet it's all there. You know, the proof is in the pudding. Have you ever heard of Thomas L. Jennings? If not, you should think about him every time you take clothes to the dry cleaner, because he invented that process. Do you know Charles Richard Drew? He was a physician responsible in this country for developing the first major blood banks. And Mark Dean was the one who introduced the idea of refrigerated trucks to transport that blood. Then there's George Carruthers. George Carruthers was an astrophysicist who developed the ultraviolet camera for NASA. And Patricia Bath, she was an eye doctor. She revolutionized ophthalmology when she invented a device that refined laser cataract surgery. Many of you, I suspect, many of you watching have probably benefited from her intelligence, her wisdom, and her creativity. And there are many others, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention Alexander Miles, because we can say thank you to him many times over, because he's the creator of an automatic elevator door. You see, all of these people were African Americans, and the list is longer and deeper if we want to look. So when we hear people say, and I know things get misconstrued and different people are involved that always try to take advantage of any kind of unrest, but when we hear someone say Black Lives Matter, it is not a cry for violence or revolution. It is an outburst asking for acknowledgement. And I know that it's currently, in some circles, this phrase and this group or movement is frequently tied to acts of violence, or at least they are portrayed that way. You know, compared to the 60s, it's really been pretty calm. But it did pop up, and we certainly are feeling the results and the residual of that violent and unnecessary death of George Floyd. But it's bigger than that. That sparked it, but this whole thing is bigger than that, because people just want to be recognized. They don't want to be ignored. They want to be included. You know, it's like churches who say, we accept everybody and welcome gay and lesbian people, but the agenda is to change them to be like a straight person. So you hate the sin but love the sinner? How about accepting and loving the whole person? Currently, the target of so many emotions emanating from all that's going on right now is resulting in statues, especially Confederate Civil War statues, being torn down and the state flag of Mississippi redesigned. I have to be honest, I have mixed emotions about that. Not that it shouldn't happen and that times don't change. I mean, we all do that, and we have symbols that bring meaning to our lives and our country and our oneness now. But by removing them, it also removes a reminder of all our past, everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And all of that came together to make us what we are. What we are. And if we don't acknowledge what we think was not right, then we are doomed to someday repeat it. The founders of our country, they were brave enough to declare their freedom from Great Britain and dared to say that all people were created equal. They just never got there, not in reality. And so what we have to ask ourselves as we face this time and this moment in history, do we believe in those things? Do we recognize that not one group or one kind of person brought this country to the great place that it has been? The founding fathers never got to the place they dreamed of. The question left to us, will our legacy be different or the same? Amen.